Imagine a being of unimaginable beauty, created by God, tasked with worship, music and the light of heaven, yet later consumed by pride and rebellion. Was Lucifer truly the angel of music in heaven? Today we'll explore the biblical truths behind his story and what it teaches us about purity, temptation, and the soul's ultimate value. Stay with us because what you're about to hear will challenge the way you see both angels and yourself. Welcome to Divine War Stories, where we uncover the hidden battles of heaven and earth, always centered on Christ, with lessons that speak directly to your life. Here we dive into scripture, explore spiritual truths, and bring stories of faith to life in ways you can understand and apply every day. In the beginning, Lucifer was created by God as a magnificent angel, radiant and full of life, tasked to lead heavenly praise and music. Scripture hints at his splendor and his high calling, reflecting God's desire for creation to honor him. This story draws a parallel with King David, who played music to worship God in the temple, reminding us that gifts are given not for pride, but for divine purpose. God calls us to live with a pure heart, avoiding sin as a distortion of our original design, because the soul is our most valuable treasure. The calling to walk in righteousness is less about perfection and more about alignment with God's will, which gives life and joy that sin can never provide. Lucifer's fall began with pride, showing the danger of seeking glory apart from God. Like him, we are tempted when we value ourselves above God's instruction. The Bible consistently warns against such paths. Psalm 101 verse 3 tells us to set no evil before our eyes. The message is clear: sin may promise fleeting pleasure, but it robs the soul of eternal fulfillment. Christ commands his followers to pursue purity, not as an impossible burden, but as a reflection of our value to him. Every act of obedience nurtures the soul and shapes our destiny, echoing the truth that God prioritizes our spiritual health over worldly success. The concept of sanctity is woven through Scripture. God's people are called to reflect his character, to live in ways that honor him. It's not about flawless performance, it's about an intentional heart, seeking alignment with divine truth. Lucifer chose self-exaltation over devotion, teaching us a cautionary tale. Conversely, the Psalms encourage praise and humble devotion, showing that God values a surrendered heart over mere talent or status. Our daily choices, though small, define the condition of the soul, and Christ gently guides us toward decisions that protect it from corruption. Music in heaven wasn't for personal glory, it was a response to God's glory. Likewise, Christ calls us to live not for self-advancement but for love and service. Sin tempts us with recognition, pride, or pleasure, yet these are fleeting. The Bible contrasts human ambition with God's eternal purposes, reminding us that even the smallest acts of kindness or obedience align us with heaven. When we obey, we participate in a larger story of redemption, contributing to God's work on earth. Lucifer's tragedy illustrates what happens when gifts become vehicles for self-centered pride instead of instruments of divine purpose. Even though God commands us toward purity, he understands our struggle. Christ knows that human hearts falter, yet he desires the soul above all else. This is the key: sanctity is relational, not just behavioral. It's about allowing God to mold our hearts, correcting pride, selfishness, and neglect of others. When we serve the needy, honor the widow, or care for orphans, we are practicing the very lessons Christ emphasized. Heaven's standard is high, but it's ultimately about love, obedience, and value placed on the soul, our eternal possession. Sin distorts beauty and purpose. Lucifer's descent teaches that brilliance without humility leads to ruin. Similarly, humans are called to avoid self-idolatry, the temptation to measure worth by talent, wealth, or influence. Biblical examples like Joseph, Daniel, and Esther show that staying close to God requires courage, obedience, and trust. God calls us to resist temptations that dim the soul's light, using Scripture as both sword and shield. Engaging with his word transforms understanding, guiding choices that cultivate virtue and prepare the heart for eternal reward. Lucifer's rebellion is not just a story of pride, it's a warning. Our hearts can be swayed subtly by desires that seem harmless but lead away from God. Christ calls us to vigilance, prayer, and discernment. Music, talent, and position are blessings meant to magnify God's glory, not our own. Every time we choose obedience over self-gratification, we reinforce the soul's value and demonstrate trust in God's wisdom. Scripture reminds us that those who honor God in small things will be entrusted with greater spiritual responsibility. God's commands often feel impossible, yet they reveal his care for our eternal well-being. Christ calls us to live in ways that protect the soul, emphasizing integrity, humility, and love. Each act of obedience is a step towards spiritual maturity, a step away from the shadows that led to Lucifer's fall. Sin tempts through immediate gratification, but Scripture encourages delayed gratification for eternal gain. Understanding God's perspective reshapes our priorities, showing that obedience is not legalism. It's a path to true freedom and lasting joy. Our journey mirrors the lessons from heaven. Gifts must be guided by reverence, pride must be replaced with humility, and sin must be confronted with courage. Christ teaches us through example, sacrifice, and instruction, showing that the soul's value surpasses wealth, fame, or temporary pleasure. Just as heavenly beings are accountable to God, we too are responsible for nurturing hearts aligned with His design. Daily reflection, scripture study, and prayer are tools to resist temptation and maintain spiritual clarity. Finally, the story of Lucifer reminds us that rebellion begins with subtle shifts in desire and thought. Christ calls us to vigilance, love, and a life that mirrors His teaching. Each choice toward compassion, truth, and justice protects the soul and demonstrates devotion to God. As we reflect on Scripture, we see that real worship, service, and obedience are active expressions of faith. Engage with the Bible, seek fellowship with believers, and participate in acts of kindness, mirroring Christ's care for the marginalized like widows and orphans. Moving deeper, Lucifer's story teaches that beauty and talent are meaningless without submission to God. In our lives, we are called to steward the gifts God has given, using them to uplift, serve, and glorify Him. Sin lures us into self-centered ambition, but Scripture repeatedly contrasts fleeting pride with eternal reward. Christ invites us to live intentionally, prioritizing the soul's health over temporal success. Just as David composed songs not for fame but to honor God, we are called to align our actions with divine purpose, understanding that every moment of obedience nurtures spiritual resilience and enriches our eternal inheritance. Pride is subtle, often dressed as confidence or ambition. Lucifer's fall illustrates how quickly a heart can turn from worship to rebellion. The Bible warns us to guard our hearts, minding what we meditate on and the desires we entertain. Christ emphasizes love, humility, and service, not self-glorification. By focusing on the soul, our most valuable possession, we are reminded to value eternal truths over temporary gratification. The Scriptures provide a mirror, revealing our inclinations and helping us cultivate virtues that reflect God's character in daily life, showing that obedience is both protection and blessing. Music and artistry in heaven were never for self-promotion but for divine praise. In our lives, every talent, word, and act becomes a reflection of our devotion. Sin tempts with immediate recognition or reward, but lasting joy comes from aligning with God's design. Scripture is full of examples. Joseph resisted temptation and was rewarded with favor. Esther risked life for God's people. These parallels teach us that holiness is relational, about surrendering to God's care for our soul, rather than a rigid checklist. Christ calls us to choose actions that build eternal value, even when the world pushes shortcuts. Even though perfection is impossible, God's command to pursue purity is an invitation to life. Each act of obedience strengthens the soul and shields it from decay caused by sin. The story of Lucifer shows the consequences of choosing self over God, highlighting the urgency of vigilance. By practicing humility, justice, and compassion, we echo Christ's priorities and protect what is most precious, the soul. Acts of charity, care for the marginalized, and service in community are tangible ways to respond to this calling, living out lessons that Scripture teaches in dynamic and practical ways. Our human hearts are tested constantly. Christ doesn't demand impossible compliance. He desires transformation through love and intention. Each decision, whether small or significant, shapes spiritual destiny. Avoiding pride, deceit, or selfish ambition cultivates resilience and alignment with God's purposes. Scripture reminds us that God watches over the soul, valuing it above all. When we choose obedience, we echo heaven's song of worship, turning talents and opportunities into instruments of divine glory. Even mundane acts can become sacred when performed with reverence and intentionality. Sin often tempts with brilliance, but true light comes from surrender. Lucifer's brilliance turned to darkness when pride took root. Similarly, our own gifts must be guided by humility and service. Christ calls us to choose the path of obedience, to resist self-exaltation, and to protect the soul's integrity. Scripture offers direction, showing that small acts of love, charity, and humility cultivate a heart aligned with God. Each choice against temptation is a step towards spiritual freedom, echoing heaven's eternal purpose, where devotion and obedience create lasting beauty and harmony. Understanding sanctity means grasping the value God places on the soul. The pursuit of righteousness is relational. It's about our connection to Him and alignment with His will. Lucifer's story is a warning of what happens when self-interest eclipses divine allegiance. Christ calls us to live intentionally, to resist sin's seductive promises, and to prioritize eternal treasures over temporary gains. Obedience is not legalistic. It is the preservation of the soul, a response to God's love, and an active participation in the divine narrative that offers joy, protection, and spiritual growth. Every time we act with compassion, integrity, or humility, we align ourselves with God's design. Service to the needy, justice for the oppressed, and generosity toward orphans and widows reflect Christ's teachings. The story of Lucifer reminds us that gifts alone do not define worth. Alignment with God's purpose does. By using our time, talent, and resources for love and mercy, we safeguard the soul and echo the worshipful intent intended in heaven. Scripture guides us step by step, offering examples of obedience and illustrating the richness of a life surrendered to God. The battle between pride and humility, sin and obedience, is ongoing in every life. Christ calls each believer to vigilance, prayer, and action rooted in love. Our souls are precious and every choice matters. Avoiding temptation, cultivating character, and embracing divine instruction keeps us on the path of true life. The story of Lucifer's fall is both cautionary and instructive, reminding us that brilliance without surrender leads to ruin, while humble devotion nurtures eternal reward. Each scripture reading strengthens discernment and deepens understanding of God's will, illuminating paths of spiritual safety and growth. As we close, remember that Christ calls us to live intentionally, cherishing the soul above all. Read the Bible daily, allow Scripture to shape your choices, and seek fellowship in a church that preaches Christ's message of love and mercy. Engage in community work, care for the vulnerable, and embrace acts of charity as Jesus taught. Let your gifts, actions, and heart reflect divine purpose, resisting sin and cultivating virtues that protect what God treasures most, the eternal soul. Your journey of obedience, humility, and service becomes a living testimony of God's glory in a world that constantly tempts away from it.